Hello everyone, Joe Dagger. I'm back to discuss John Boyd's OODA Loop. John Boyd was an American fighter pilot and trainer. If people know about him, it generally has something to do with the OODA Loop. Fran Osinga and Chet Richards are probably the two authorians that I relied on most for this presentation. The acronym OODA stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. The most popular interpretations that you'll see around the web and in different books, the OODA Loop suggests that you go through this cycle, the OODA Loop, and you outthink the opponent. You're going to build a competitive advantage by quicker cycles. Contrary to that belief, the OODA Loop process is not circular. Richard says observation, orientation, and action are continuous processes, and decisions are made occasionally in the consequences of them. He says there is no OODA Loop because it's just not as simple as observe, orientate, then decide, then act. I think I read somewhere there was 33 arrows in it, but I could only come up with about 30, I think, at best. And the funny thing about it is that when Boyd said faster OODA Loop speed, he meant all of them, all these arrows. But it really is not that complicated if we break it down. Since this is not a standalone presentation, think about the previous section that we just did on laddering, where we discussed the 5 pillars of observation from Sharon. Observing, listening, noticing, gathering, and interpreting. And you can see how that affects here in the loop, how that is applied. And you can see the outside information that we're getting in, the unfolding circumstances that may change how we observe, unfolding interaction with the environment, the feedback, that's all coming back to us, and it's around those 5 pillars. And we feed forward into the orientation part of it. But also the orientation, our environment, our orientation is also feeds into how we observe. We're biased. Orientation, I like to use this as sort of those personas that we're talking about. Putting yourself in your customer's shoes, the environment they're in. The personas must be well matched, though, to reality, because it's a dynamic process. And our actions are dependent on us being grounded so that we can influence a given situation and our actions can flow smoothly and rapidly from orientation. Otherwise, we hesitate and lessen our chances for a successful outcome. Think of it as a lack of rhythm in our sales and marketing. Then we go through into that decide step, and that's used to form a hypothesis or make a decision that we need to test through some action. And of course, act is the doing. Remember, I liken the OODA Loop to cap-do if you read the literature that's accompanying this slideshow. Note some of the components here. Besides that, what most of us think is the OODA Loop, and that's probably the strongest one is the implicit guidance and control. The decision hypothesis link is used when you must control explicitity. Against a well-prepared opponent, let's say, explicit control should be rare. That shouldn't happen that often, since it's always much slower than implicit control. And explicit decisions are needed when no effective action is available via the implicit link, such as when training or experimenting. When we think of using implicit guidance control, that's really the key for the speed. In other words, most of the time, people in groups do not employ the explicit, right? The sequential observe, orientate, decide, and act. It's the implicit guidance control, what I like to call standard work. This is how we normally go about work. This is the speed when everybody's on the same page. That's what it basically means here. If we're going to experiment when not in action against an opponent, okay, in Boyd's terms, or not in action with the environment, we are engaging in some sort of training at that point in time. And we need to reach a level of proficiency with it, or we're not going to be very effective. And let me back up a second here and look at this. Is that with the standard work, as we go through the standard work, the unfolding interaction with the environment, this over here, this is how we're coming through with standard work. Right? And we go through here, and this may change our observation. What happens here? This is our feedback loop that we're using. We observe, and this might change a little bit. So it's not like standard work. There isn't anything that we're changing or doing differently. It depends on what the situation calls for. We may have a different action in this loop because of our observations and decided upon in our standard work here by the environment. If we want to have different training or we want to try something different, then that's when we form the hypothesis and we come through here and we practice it. So we have all this going on. And as we practice it then, we will train or we'll experiment. Many times, without experimentation, we make a decision and we get feedback and we observe what we think it might happen and we go through. So there is a time that we may not test the actions, and we'll go ahead and use it with kind of look at it through a different lens. Because explicit decisions, this loop here, okay, are needed a couple different times. They're experiments. If we know what to do, we just do it. Okay, that's the implicit guidance and control. If we don't know what to do, it becomes a decision that we make, and it's really an experiment. We may still run that experiment and see what happens in the environment and come through here also. Or we may test it and prototype it to become proficient enough before we try doing it. Or we may go ahead and make a decision, get some observations about it, of what we think will happen, and then do this and go with an experiment, and then the next time around, try it in real life. And if we try it in real life, see what happens, soon it may become standard work. The purpose of John Boyd's OODA Loop is to create continuous interaction with the external world. Once we have our orientation, our situational awareness right, we understand our personas, let's say. Then by interacting with our customer, we keep our orientations aligned. It should be sort of a set of actions that we can apply intuitively. I like the way they said it. We need an organizational climate that encourage what we might call OODA Loop thinking. What happens here is doesn't happen by accident. It's about creating new processes and limiting old ones. We leave them evolve. And you hear me talk a lot about sales and marketing should evolve, but this is how it evolves. Because the orientation will shape our observation. We'll change here in our observation based on our orientation. It shapes our action, and in turn is shaped by feedback. What they like to talk about in the OODA Loop is getting, OODA Loop was like describing operating inside the opponent's OODA Loop, Boyd used to say. It's like they're moving in slow motion. What I'd like for you to think about is if you had very good customer information, you have the personas right, you have your evaluation and monitoring correctly. What happens here is your feedback from your customers is happening at a regular rate. What is that telling you? Okay, we're operating inside an opponent's OODA Loop. We're operating inside our customer's head. We're watching their actions. It's like they're moving in slow motion. We get it. And that's what it was all about, of this changing the situation more rapidly than the other side can comprehend, than our competitors can comprehend, because we're inside the customer's mind. Competition is all dynamic, though. And unless we're shaping this orientation, these personas, by interaction with the environment, it quickly will get out of date. We get stuck, let's say, in this observe gateway, observing data. It'll mismatch what we predict and what actually happens. Okay? We have to be changing our orientation. This feed forward has to be forcing us, okay, to change. So when you think about OODA speed, it is not the speed of our actions. Doing something dumb, but doing it at high speed really doesn't provide us a competitive advantage. Sometimes, we may even simply think that we're observing and acting. That we're going from here to here. And that's good. Okay, that means we're all on the same page. That means our orientation is correct between the organizations and within our own especially. So when you're doing OODA loops right, accuracy and speed improve together. They don't trade off. You get faster. And that's the primary function of management, is to build an organization that gets better and better at these things. I hope that shows you a little bit on how we can use the OODA loop, because I think that is so important as we move forward, is to look at that OODA loop, look at those personas within each given section of the funnel of opportunity. In the engage, in the explore, in the empower. If we're operating within given OODA loop, in each of those sections, you can see how that feedback occurs. And that's what we're going to talk about more, is the monitoring feedback cycle and that orientation and this. But keep thinking of it as the OODA loop, that we have all these things going on, and this is how we're testing, this is how we're making decisions, this is how we entire loop to be able to improve ourselves.